In a Violent Nature is perhaps the most polarizing horror film to release this year and echoes a similar discourse to Skinamarink, where on the one hand you'll have die-hard horror purists deconstructing it as a subversive homage that attempts to reinvent the genre wheel, which will represent a fair bit of this video, while on the other, more casual, conventional moviegoers might be left bored, shrugging their shoulders and asking, what was the point in any of that? Well, besides no film really needing a point to exist, In a Violent Nature is undoubtedly a unique take on the slasher formula by telling its story almost exclusively from the killer's point of view, albeit, if not necessarily original, given there are some brilliantly meta perspective shift slashers already out there, like Maniac and Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, both of which I've covered if you're interested in checking them out. However, unlike those two films, the somewhat experimental and, dare I say, loosely academic nature of In a Violent Nature makes it harder to recommend if you're looking for something that's strictly scary or disturbing. That's not to say it doesn't have its fair share of horrific moments or is some sort of pompous intellectual commentary that only arrogantly seasoned genre aficionados will understand. In the case of the latter, it's actually pretty far from it, with writer-director Chris Nash even humbly rejecting such high pedestal claims and insisting it's purely a nostalgic homage to the slasher flicks he watched growing up.
Please, help!
He summarized its concept as simply moving the camera to a different spot, yet it's that simplicity that makes it so special because it completely overhauls how you take in the horror, especially in its final moments. The thing is, up until its release, I heard so much word of mouth about the film being this methodically slow-paced, unconventional art house slasher that presents itself more like a nature documentary or minimalist kitchen sink piece of pure cinema verite, rather than your typical horror flick. And yes, while that's not technically incorrect, it's actually relatively spot on. What is most striking is how it jarringly juxtaposes such a niche culture of nuanced artistry with an unapologetic embrace of every trope and formulaic concept seen in every crass, low-budget 80s slasher flick that inspired it. In other words, it's deceptively and very much intentionally a film you've seen dozens of times before, and in the same interview with Time, Nash even admits as much. I wouldn't necessarily say it's trying to be satirical, given Nash claimed to aim to avoid that, but it has an almost darkly comedic pretension to how it contrasts this sort of meditative observational serenity and blatant metaphorical undercurrent with very of its era campiness and practical gore effects, from cheesy dialogue to someone's head exploding like a watermelon to whatever the fuck happens to Yoga Girl. Oh my god, we will get to that one. It's like a clash between highbrow and lowbrow artistry. It literally takes the basic premise of Friday the 13th Part 2, a sequel to a film that, to its own admission, was a cheap commercial effort to capitalize on the success of Halloween, and spawned a series of conceptually generic formulaic pulpy B-movies focused on provocation over storytelling, and fuses it with the polar opposite sensibilities of non-mainstream auteurism in the vein of Terrence Malick, Gus Van Sant's Death Trilogy, and Christ, dare I mention, elevated horror. It's like going wine and cheese tasting after getting high and drunk on cheap cider. It's beautifully ridiculous. Both tastes couldn't be more culturally and aesthetically apart, almost like it's toying with the fallacy of arthouse films that mask their insecure lack of substance with fluffy filmmaking concepts to appear deep. At this point, if it isn't clear, I thoroughly enjoyed In a Violent Nature. Heck, it might even be one of my favorite films of this year, and while there is a significant metaphor to address, I think you should ultimately take the film for what it is at face value, which, as Chris Nash puts it, is all about letting nature speak for itself. Now, just before we go any further, this video is sponsored by Rocket Money. Look, I imagine I'm not the only one guilty of subscribing to nearly a dozen streaming services and then forgetting to cancel them, thus sinking needless amounts of money into something that could be better used elsewhere, like, I don't know, paying my mortgage. Well, that's where Rocket Money comes in. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. By signing up to the Rocket Money app, you can monitor your subscriptions and other expenses, and give Rocket Money permission to to cancel subscriptions on your behalf, especially services that don't like to make it easy for you. You can even upload your bills, like your internet and phone charges, and ask Rocket Money to negotiate a lower fee, thus taking the pain and frustration out of those long, arduous chats with your provider, who will likely just try to sell you something else. Rocket Money has helped save its customers up to $740 a year when they use all the features, with over $500 million in cancelled subscriptions alone. You can save more and spend less today and join over 5 million other members by simply going to rocketmoney.com/RyanH or clicking the link in the description box below to get started for free and even unlock more features with premium. Anyway, with the stylistic context established, we can finally get into the plot. In A Violent Nature tells the story of a group of friends on a camping trip in northern Ontario, who stumble upon the ruins of an old fire watchtower where one of them takes a mysterious locket resting on a rusted shovel that, unbeknownst to them, awakens a zombified lump of muscle called Johnny. From here, we follow Johnny's entire quest to locate and retrieve his missing locket that we learn was once gifted to him by his father as a cherished memory of his deceased mother. His backstory partially mirrors aspects of Friday the 13th's Jason Voorhees and My Bloody Valentine's Harry Warden, where a later exposition dump explains that 70 years ago, Johnny's father was a greedy shop owner who was despised by the local loggers who took their anger out on his autistic son Johnny. However, one fateful night, a drunk logger who was out of work after breaking his ankle tripping over one of Johnny's toy cars tricked Johnny into climbing the watchtower under the belief there was a stash of toys, and upon getting to the top, the logger jumped out wearing an old firefighter outfit, causing Johnny to fall to his death. The loggers then attempted to put the firefighter mask on Johnny to make it seem like a self-inflicted accident, but Johnny's father later confronted the loggers, only to die in an altercation. To avoid legal ramifications, the logging camp executives brushed the incident under the rug, but sometime later, they shut down the entire operation when they discovered the mutilated remains of the loggers as though they'd been torn apart by an animal. The legend simply goes that Johnny's vengeful spirit was likely responsible for the massacre, and ever since, anytime someone disturbs his slumber, his spirit rises again, as was the case 10 years prior to the events of the film, in what's known as the White Pine Slaughter that resulted in the massacre of several park rangers. That's basically the entire story in a nutshell, but akin to other formulaic 80s slasher flicks, it's not exactly a plot-heavy film. If anything, it's actually closer to a character study in how it emphasizes the way Johnny moves and behaves in the environment to give us some implication to how he thinks and feels. In an interview with IndieWire, Johnny's actor Ry Barrett not only watched plenty of monster movies to prepare for the physicality of his performance to do all the talking, but was also encouraged to watch animal attack videos to reinforce the distinct duality between Johnny and nature. Speaking of Nash's intent, Johnny is very much the embodiment of a wild animal, in the same way John Carpenter presented Michael Myers as a force of nature instead of your typical human antagonist. In Johnny's case, it's not so much a means of making him seem omnipotent, supernatural, or enigmatically evil, despite the irony of him being undead, but rather showing him as a product of nature. Nash explained to Slate magazine that the film was originally titled Sleeping Animal to signify Johnny as an animal literally awakened from hibernation. Specifically, Nash referred to Johnny as a reverse golem, where according to Jewish folklore, the golem was a creature made from the elements of the earth and brought to life to do man's own bidding, whereas Johnny, to paraphrase Nash, was born back from the earth as a tool of the earth's own bidding. Or to explain that further, what you effectively have is nature's revenge tale, where Johnny is triggered, summoned, and directed by the sounds of disturbance that penetrate the peaceful ambience that makes up the subversive atmosphere. There's deliberately no score or big dramatic spooky forest vibes, because in Johnny's eyes, this is his home that's being disturbed, and all he wants to do is quiet that noise, find his locket, and restore the natural order. It's basically about a grumpy old man trying to get kids off his lawn. This is first identified through visual association when Johnny wanders past a used bear trap and then a decaying animal, before stumbling upon an antagonistic hunter, being confronted by a park ranger warning him about the harm he's causing, and what Johnny then proceeds to do is essentially put an end to that destructive presence on nature. Unfortunately, however, Johnny doesn't locate his locket, so he ventures onwards, soon following this scent via sounds of gunshots coming from the loud, obnoxious campers, particularly dick-measuring douchebags crying about cancel culture, ableism, toxic masculinity, and whatever other trending buzzwords you young whippersnappers use today. As typical with most classic slasher flicks, these characters would usually be our protagonists, but since we're seeing this world through Johnny's perspective, they are technically our antagonists, especially since they indirectly stole something of genuine emotional value to Johnny. That's the thing, for all the talk about Johnny's duality with nature, especially in the closing monologue, that highlights this central theme of nature's indifference and how animals are driven by impulse and instinct with little reason for their actions, Johnny is remarkably humanized. Obviously, it helps that we spend our time walking in his shadow, but you rarely come to care about the guy. I mean, tragic backstory aside, our grotesque rotting corpse of a killer is called fucking Johnny. Johnny's our boy, our lad. How can you not like someone with the name Johnny? Put it this way, Johnny Wayne Gacy would give off a slightly less sinister vibe. My point is, I genuinely think the movie deliberately contradicts its theme because Johnny is driven by a sincere, sympathetic motive. His rest has been disturbed, and the only thing that can restore harmony is the memory of his parents, symbolized through the locket. In fact, if you really stretch it, all this dude wants is to be at peace with his family again, and all these assholes are getting in the way, granted of no intentional fault of their own. Now, once again, the group itself is made up of the usual archetypes you expect to see in every slasher flick, and I like how it gives them little fragments of dialogue that Johnny pays no attention to help convey some dynamic within the group's relationship and makes the overall world feel more alive. Their B-plot is framed like we're watching from behind the scenes, and seeing Johnny move from A to B not only plays off the trope of the killer appearing and disappearing randomly, but reinforces how grounded Johnny is in the natural setting. He watches the group from the darkness before eventually killing one of them, and proceeds to drag the body to the ranger station to collect the old firefighter mask that's iconic to his original fate. The next day, Johnny essentially behaves like my dog and wanders aimlessly only for his attention to be drawn to a new human, and they immediately become his new fixation. He wanders into a lake and then casually drowns one of the campers, and what's so effective about it is that despite it being the least graphic kill, it's just how quiet and effortless it all is. It reinforces the theme of nature's indifference to our existence. The birds still keep chirping, the wind continues to whistle through the trees, and the water soon returns to steady and undisturbed. The world just moves on as if nothing happened. However, it isn't long until the subtle, evocative feelings of this kill turn into what the absolute fuck when Johnny then attacks another girl doing yoga, and before she's killed, you'll ask yourself, why doesn't she just jump down the hill to escape? Well, it might sound like a cop-out, but as Scream put it, slasher characters infamously make dumb decisions, and as I've said throughout, the film isn't shying away from the cliches and tropes associated with the slashers that inspired it. If anything, it makes it more authentic. Although in my case, I didn't get too hung up on it because I was just a little too distracted with the whole piercing her skull with a hook and then pulling her head through her chest, ironically toying with the flexibility yoga enables. But put it this way, be grateful she didn't jump, otherwise you would be robbed of this year's second best movie kill. The next scene is probably my favourite, as we hear one of the douchebags throwing the keys of our eventual final girl Chris into the forest, and they land next to Johnny. But instead of the tension of Chris going to find them, we're treated to this cutely sentimental moment of Johnny embracing his inner child when he plays with the keyring car that echoes the toy car that caused the logger incident in the first place. It further humanizes Johnny, only for the moment to be cut short by more disturbance, which causes Johnny to get pissed off, pick up his pace, and get into an altercation with the two douchebags, who manage to shoot him and attempt to escape. Naturally, as you might expect, Johnny takes a moment to recuperate before getting back up and one-shotting one of the guys with his axe before crushing the other one's head with a rock. After once again not finding his locket, Chris and her outcast romantic interest Colt arrive to warn of the killings, only to find Johnny, who notices Chris is the one wearing his locket. He pursues them back to the ranger station that very evening, only to once again be incapacitated by the ranger, who we remember argued with the hunter at the beginning of the film. It's heavily implied in the dialogue that Johnny and the ranger have historical beef, as 10 years ago during the White Pine slaughter, Johnny killed his dad, and thus the ranger basically became a Tommy Jarvis-style character who knows how to stop Johnny. However, dumb decisions come crawling back when the ranger tries to pass his gun onto Colt so he can restrain Johnny, and no surprise, Johnny gets right back up and performs the film's most diabolical, harrowingly prolonged kill, which I think trumps the Yoga Girl kill. As Chris and Colt escape, Johnny paralyzes the ranger by breaking his spine, thus robbing him of his seemingly heroic status, and slowly proceeds to turn on a woodcutter, pierce the ranger with a hook, and drag his helpless body towards the cutter, much to the ranger's feeble attempts to whimper. As fucked up as it sounds, the way it's drawn out makes it almost seem as though Johnny is being petty and relishing in the build-up as he tests the cutter first while the ranger can only hopelessly watch. He doesn't even then kill the ranger immediately. Instead, he puts his arm through the cutter first, and then finally his head, and I cannot imagine the locked-in syndrome the ranger is experiencing, just waiting to be put out of his misery. Following this, the pace takes a sudden change when Johnny catches up to Chris and Colt, attempting to set up a trap to stop him, which leads Colt to overconfidently believe he can distract Johnny, but at this point, Johnny is just done fucking around, and abruptly and kind of hilariously anticlimactically kills Colt, thus again ruining another person's attempt at being heroic. What I love so much about the vibe in this moment is that it feels like a massive middle finger, as Johnny proceeds to aggressively hack at Colt's mushy head, as though his reaction is less of a gotcha smartass, and more like Johnny was legitimately startled at Colt sneaking up behind him. Hell, I would even argue it's technically the one jump scare in the entire film, and the single person it scares is fucking Johnny. This then leaves us with Chris, who does the one smart thing and leaves the locket behind and beels into the forest with zero hesitation. What's interesting about Chris's escape is that she's met with sudden, loud, aggressive ambience from the forest that contrasts with the peaceful, low-key ambience we know of Johnny's journey, signifying as though she's being tormented into leaving, as well as showing us a switch in perspective, as nature is made out to be a psychological force that's left her with PTSD. The next morning, she's picked up by a stranger whose actress coincidentally was a character in Friday the 13th Part 2, and these last 20 minutes will likely be the most polarizing part of the film. On paper, the idea of taking us away from Johnny's perspective seems to defeat the purpose of the film, and while yes, the monologue is a little too on the nose, it's an incredibly brilliant, even arguably masterful bit of suspense. The reason is, because we spend all our time with Johnny and there's fundamentally no threat for him to worry about, it desensitizes us to the horror. Unlike most slashers that make us feel helpless for the characters, aka the classic Hitchcock bomb under the table technique, we're put into a position of power throughout the film, so you're never conditioned to feel any sense of fear. However, now that we're in Chris's shoes, we are made vulnerable to Johnny, because we have no idea where he is. We've been stripped of that knowledge and power, we've lost our safety net, so to speak. As such, the way the camera just lurks and lingers on Chris and the stranger creates an overwhelming sense of dread that Johnny is going to show up out of nowhere. But at the same time, they drive so far away that there's no physical way for Johnny to catch up, since we know from the film's real-time logic that Johnny can't just appear out of nowhere, he's limited by his footsteps. Yet the fact that that tension remains so strongly says so much about how powerful a presence he is throughout the film and the lasting impact he has on Chris. As for the stranger, she tells a story about her brother Bobby surviving being mauled by a bear 30 years prior, while investigating mutilated animal carcasses that seemed unusual for a bear to commit. After describing the ordeal, you might be led to assume it must have something to do with Johnny, but ultimately it doesn't. The stranger simply explains that nobody is sure what happened to the bear, or why it acted the way that it did. That's the point it's ultimately trying to make. We'll simply never know why nature does what it does. As she bluntly concludes, quoting her brother,
"Animals don't get too hung up on reason."
However, going back to a point I made earlier, there's still both a contradiction and irony to her inconsequential point. Johnny's actions might embody the impulsive and unpredictable reality of nature and its creatures, but he isn't necessarily just some depraved, ravenous killer. He had a human motive that's cemented in the final shot, when we return to where Chris left the locket to see that it's now gone. In a reversal to the ending of Halloween, instead of the heavy breathing and atmosphere to suggest Johnny might still be out there, we see calmness has restored, and peace has returned to nature to suggest all might actually be good again.
'Twas early in the spring when I set out to go to work up in the woods in North Ontario. The unemployment office said they'd send me through with the little Abitibi and the survey crew. And those black flies, the little black flies, always a black fly no matter where you go. I'll die with the black fly picking my bones in North Ontario.